literally just texted Cale to ask him what he wanted to name the episode, and I named it exactly what he texted me. Crazy. Basically a fortune teller. Anyways, keeping this one short, we're talking about epistemology, theories of knowledge. How do we know it's true? Cale went off this week, guys. It was awesome. So, enjoy, please. Alright, so it's been a while. Welcome back. It's just me and Cale this week. This is episode 8, and we're going to be talking about epistemology. Subtitle, How Do We Know Things? Just taking more time to think about how we think, to look into what we deem as true. Do you have anything else to add on that?
I think we just want to talk about different theories of knowledge. I think a lot of people don't realize that there's different ways to seek out the truth and different ways to define the truth, so it should be fun.
So we're going to be covering 3. We're going to be talking about the scientific method, we're going to be talking about paradigms, and we're also going to be talking about the literal and the symbolic meaning of not just the Bible, but that'll probably be what we end up talking about just because that's what we're more familiar with. So just to start off, the scientific method, from how I've learned it, has 7 steps. So the first step is you find a question, regardless of what that question is. You research the topic and the question. You establish a hypothesis that is 1, testable, and 2, falsifiable. You test your hypothesis through experiments. You interpret and analyze the data from the experiment. And then you observe and document the results. And then the 7th step, which is the biggest step, is reporting your findings to the greater scientific community. And this step is called validation because other scientists are going to go and repeat the experiment, and they're going to support or refute the results that you have obtained. And that's either going to give weight or take weight away from the question, the theory, and the hypothesis that you've put in. And in my opinion, it's really effective. What do you think?
Well, yeah, obviously it was revolutionary, and it's obviously helped us advance the field of science a lot. I think, of course, just like anything, it has its limitations. But just in general, it's a very analytical, straightforward, cut and dry kind of theory. It's either yes or no, it is or it isn't kind of.
I was going to say that thing you said. I agree about the limitations. I think one of the biggest ones is that us as scientists who are practicing, we're still human beings first. And human beings are, they're a species driven by emotion. And you can't calculate through the scientific experiments and the formulas for the emotion that we're going to garner as human beings first and scientists second. So when it comes to, I'm going to ask you this question, when it comes to relationships and mental illness, do you think that that's too far out of reach of the scientific method, or do you think the psychologists and the philosophers, they're navigating that enough that we can use the scientific method to help in that area? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think we kind of mentioned in that episode on mental health, but obviously a nice balance would be great. I think there's space for both, and the scientific method has been very important to advance the field. Right. So I don't think it's out of the purview of science to deal with mental illness. But again, like you said, it suggests that the observer is the subject looking at an object. Right. Which is not the case when you're talking about people.
No, exactly.
So yeah, I think that's kind of where the limitation is. But yeah, I guess room for both for sure.
Okay. I was going to say, I agree with you. It's extremely useful, and it's propelled us from, the biological side of things. As a student, we learned about Darwin and his finches, and he used the scientific method to discover evidence to support heavily the theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, I'm not saying like he proved it. Nobody's saying he proved it, but there was heavy support, and that caused a paradigm shift. It made people change the way they were thinking, but we'll get into that later. I just want to emphasize that, like, just because we don't believe that the scientific method, or at least I'm speaking for myself, is the only way of knowing what's true, it is a truth. And I don't want people questioning scientists without real reason for it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, though, that, well, I don't know if you were making this point, but I think that we need to question scientists.
Right.
I think, like, just from the stats course that I took this year, like, I learned that nothing is for sure. It's all, like, probability. Like, this is probably true, like, to this degree of confidence. So, I mean, like, obviously that's, like, strong, and it'll, like, you can gain knowledge from it, but I think people just need to keep in mind that even, like, science or, like, published papers aren't the end-all be-all.
Right. Just because it's a published paper, just because we're using it to study in post-secondary, doesn't mean it's an ultimate truth. I agree.
Yeah.
Transition into the paradigms now. I just finished my capstone, which is the highest level course that you take in your degree at Augustana, and ours was a theory of biology course, and we talked about Thomas Kuhn and paradigms. So just to start off, a paradigm is basically a base thought pattern, a school of thinking. And Thomas Kuhn, which is basically the guy who was at the head of all of this, he saw science as a puzzle, and that a part of the game is that an answer can be found. So when ideas in science fall apart, the textbooks are rewritten to fit the new paradigm. How I understand it, because obviously I'm not Thomas Kuhn, so take this with a grain of salt, is that science goes through a few versions in each cycle of paradigms. It starts off in a period of normal science that's interrupted by a revolution, which is when two competing paradigms are competing to try and prove the same point. This leads into a paradigm testing period where scientists will be using both paradigms, both ways of thinking, and researching both of those. And that leads into a crisis period where there's a division between the paradigms and the scientific community. Those two lead to incommensurability. So that is, as I understand it, when the two paradigms prevent the discussion of theories because of a lack of communication or shared nomenclature between the two schools. So, like, you could think about that as an English school, like Harvard, trying to talk to a school in France and not having any way of speaking, first of all. But if they had learned different types of math, I don't even know if there's different types of math, but if they'd learned different types of math, they couldn't really communicate their data between themselves. And that's a huge thing, because in science, we're working together as a community, like I said before, to find a goal. So this leads to non-cumulative science as the third stage. Since there's no communication between the two schools, they might be researching the same questions or arriving at the same answers, which is redundant, but eventually one of the two paradigms is going to win out. And then a gestalt switch occurs, which is just a fancy name for a change in thinking. And the old paradigm is going to retire to fix the revolution, and you go back to periods of normal science. I know that was just a bunch, but...
Yeah, so just to make sure I understand you correctly, would you say that the paradigm is kind of the overarching structure where all scientific discoveries kind of exist within it?
Yes, I would be okay with agreeing with that, yes.
Okay.
So off of that basis, my question for you is, obviously we're thinking about this in a scientific sense, but do you think that paradigms, they move, like our thoughts, those are what's driving them, is paradigm shifts in any way we're thinking, just like our relationships with one another or stuff like that?
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's obviously been like big culture change over the thousands, millions of years.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy, or it's like if you think about how people thought about things in the past, you can't kind of like line it up one to one.
Right.
Like we just think in a different way.
Right.
Than people would have thought 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago.
I was just going to chime in there. In chemistry, one of my profs on the first day, he was like, we're going to go through me having an expert's bias. It was OChem. And he was like, I understand all of this, so I don't really remember what it's like not to understand it. I think that's the same thing as what you're trying to say right now, is like, I personally believe from the evidence that was delivered to me that the earth is round. But like there was people who thought that if they sailed past the tip of Africa, they would just fall off the planet, until a dude actually did it and didn't fall off the planet. And it forced people to change the way they think. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Paradigms, they're not something to scoff over, because if you're not willing to change the way you look at the world, how are you ever going to change with the times, like Cale was saying earlier? Because like I find myself complaining about stuff like the USB-C. Why did they do that? The old USB port was fine.
Shut up. Shut your ugly old time ancient ass up.
You know what I'm saying? But I don't know the science behind it. Maybe it charges stuff faster, Maybe it's more effective for the company. It's changing with the times. I'm not going to fall behind, right? Do you think that's an important factor?
Like, is it important
to be adaptable?
To be adaptable? Of course.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, as, like, you kind of said this when you were explaining at the start, but, like, as new information arises within the current paradigm, it's going to, like, that's what's going to cause the shift.
Right. Is
that new information, like, comes up.
And it's, like, undeniable? Would you say that? The information?
Yeah, I mean, like, that's probably what leads to the shift in thinking. But it's kind of weird because, like, those things, like the facts, are interpreted through the paradigm, but they also inform the paradigm.
Right.
So it's like a two-way relationship. So
they are the rules, but they also write the rules.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then, I think it's even more important what you said earlier, earlier about questioning scientists, to drive that to anybody who's changing your paradigm. Because if they're working within a new paradigm to change your paradigm, they're writing the rules, but they're also delivering the new information. So obviously, accept and learn from every single person that you meet and is willing to deliver you new information. But like, don't be a sheep, question everything to a logical amount, like, don't be one of the people who's just arguing for the sake of arguing,
Yeah. So if we take the question, like, how do we know what is true? Like, how do you think the idea of paradigms helps us in answering that question?
I would say specifically with the paradigms, because at the end of the cycle, one of the paradigms is going to be forced to retire. It may not give us the truth, but it's a stepwise motion towards a closer approximation of the truth, which I think as human beings really is as far as we can get right now. Because I don't know off the top of my head the exact truths that exist in our world, but I don't think there's very many of them. You know what I'm saying?
Like ultimate truth?
Okay, what would you say, like, define your definition of ultimate truth? Because I don't know if it's the same as what I looked up an exact truth earlier. Here, I'll look this up quickly.
I mean, like, when I say ultimate truth, I guess I mean, like, what is true no matter who thinks about it, or like what your opinions about some,
right,
like separate the truth from opinions,
right.
So like what is true no matter what, no matter like how you look at it.
I would agree. And would you agree that that is the same as saying correct in every detail and strictly accurate? Obviously it's a less enveloped definition, but
yeah.
Okay, so then yes, I don't believe in our world, because the world is dynamic and ever changing, that there is very many ultimate truths. Therefore, I think as paradigms, just the way they are, they're forcing us out of old ways of thinking and closer to an approximate truth in our dynamic world. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you? Like, do you look at it differently?
Like about ultimate truth?
About paradigms being a driving factor in getting there.
I think it's kind of like similar to like the development of like individual mindsets. That, like sometimes you'll learn something and then it'll like change how you think about it.
Right.
And you'll go, like I never really like thought about it that way. And then so like that advances your thinking to make it more sophisticated, because you still hold on to what your interpretation was before.
Right.
But now you have this new way of looking at it.
So, yeah. I was just going to say, because in the paradigm, the old one has to retire, I don't want people to think that that means you just drop what you thought before. Like Cale said, you hold on to that one and you check yourself. That's where I was at before. I've been presented new information, and that's forced me to change the way I think. But I think looking back at where we were before is vital, because it prevents us from making the same mistakes, even in our thinking.
Yeah. As you say that, I was just thought of like kind of the idea of letting old things die. Like sacrificing old ways of thinking. Like at one hand you like kind of have to hold on to it, but you also have to let it go.
Right.
I know that's kind of paradoxical, but you can't like cling to your paradigm.
Exactly.
Or as a society you can't like hold on to it.
Right. Because as soon as you start clinging to it, that's when you're deeming your paradigm to be ultimately true, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and then it constricts everything, and it doesn't allow for the expansion of knowledge.
Exactly. And go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say that like usually when like people start to cling to worldviews or paradigms or whatever is when they go to shit. Like
yeah.
Like you get so constricted and it clamps everything down that it just blows up. And
exactly.
You're gonna get that shift anyways.
Exactly. I wish we had a historian to speak on this, but I could bet that the schooling that was happening right before the power vacuum that allowed Hitler to rise into power, it was probably crazy. Like the people were probably being fed 16 different types of information so they don't know what to think, and then here comes the dude with the solution. You know what I'm saying? Drop the paradigm, cling to his paradigm, ultimately true. And it's like, I'd never do that. You have no clue what they were going through, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the benefit of like ideology, I guess, is that like you kind of have one answer to all the questions,
right?
And then you just hold on to that to feel safe and secure.
And I don't think that should be the goal all the time. It seems to be for everybody to feel safe and secure, but like being uncomfortable is what drives us to work harder, right?
Yeah.
I would just say we've talked about this a bunch of times. You get the most from the people you disagree with in tough conversations, So.
Yeah.